Tony Farrell, and I used to work for South Yorkshire Police up until 2010, July, as the Principal Intelligence Analyst. And I suppose I'm infamous now for being dismissed from the police, and I'm in a reasonably high-profile employment tribunal case with them for the dismissal, which I claim is unfair.
Okay, and why were you dismissed?
Well, I held a belief that they said was incompatible, but there's a lot more to it than that. Basically, I made a stance at work regarding an assignment I was doing. The assignment concerned a strategic threat, and the threat in particular concerned the domain of counter-terrorism. And what caused me a problem is that I was expected to go along with a government narrative which said that the threat was coming from Islamic terrorism, and I made a stance against that because without seeing proofs I wasn't prepared to say that when I thought there was a more sinister threat around, and that was coming from, sadly, internal tyranny. And I say that on the basis of issues like 9/11 and the London bombings on July the 7th, 2005. And our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I saw the threat as something quite different from what the government narrative wanted me to say was the main threat, and what my employers, South Yorkshire Police senior managers, wanted me to say.
And can you give us some examples how you came to those conclusions?
Yes, it was funny really, because in the course of having this assignment to do, which is a strategic threat, and what's more, it was a little bit different from a strategic threat in as much as it was a simplified model of threat. I simply had not anticipated a problem, and I dropped on in the week before the assignment was due, which was on the 8th of July 2010. I came across information on the internet all of a sudden, quite by accident, at home, which alerted me to the possibility that 9/11 was an inside job. Now that came from sources such as Alex Jones, Jesse Ventura at first. That was what I dropped on in the first instance, and that prompted me to look at other things that were available readily on the internet, which included the film Loose Change and 9/11 Ripple Effect. And having sat through and watched those, I was prompted to try and read a little bit more about it. And it wasn't difficult to come to a conclusion almost immediately that something was radically wrong with the government's narrative, the US government's narrative on 9/11. And I was familiar with issues such as the New World Order and what was underpinning that. So I did see 9/11 immediately. I was alerted to the possibility. I saw that as an example of the New World Order at work, and I was horrified and shocked. And the problem I had with that was it immediately put me in a difficult position, because I knew in a week's time I was expected to be in front of a board at South Yorkshire Police giving a presentation which was producing the strategic threat assessment matrix, where top of the table in the threat stakes would be the threat coming from Islamic terrorism. And my way of thinking was that I no longer believe that this was 19 Muslim suicidal maniacs that crashed into that building. I believed it was something different, and an inside job deliberately perpetrated to blame the Muslims in order to justify an aggressive foreign policy agenda in the Middle East, which was, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that were to follow close on the hand of this. So I saw it as something sinister, and of course, without proofs, I wasn't prepared to lie. And this was just on the basis of 9/11 alone. So I was thrown into a state of shock, and I was at work. After it dawned on me, I was at work the next day, and I was struggling with the assignment then, in terms of how do I cope with this? If I stick my head above the parapet, I'm in trouble. And I actually went and spoke to a minister at lunchtime and said, I've got a crisis of conscience. And he said, have you, shocked by what I told him about 9/11? Bear in mind, this was open source information, so I wasn't breaching Official Secrets Act. But I simply got the shock when he turned around and said, "Have you thought about the London bombings?" And I was rocked back in my seat, and I'm a bit embarrassed because I hadn't actually considered the London bombings by any stretch of the imagination. But when I got home that evening, I resolved to check out the London bombings, and with the expectation of reassuring myself that at least it wasn't the case in the United Kingdom, because I couldn't at this stage believe that our government would, be capable of doing such a thing as fabricating a story on the London bombings. But when I looked at it at home, I was immediately worried, because films like Mind the Gap, Ludicrous Diversion, that were even 7/7 Ripple Effect, were readily available on the internet. I watched as many videos that I could, and then read the official account, and that immediately alerted me. And on the back of 9/11, I felt as though I wasn't now able to say that the threat was coming from Islamic terrorism, and the time was approaching when the assignment was due. So I went in to the police, my Director of Intelligence, on the 6th of July with a bit of a red alert saying, "Look, the internet is exposing 9/11, and people are waking up to it." I says, "And it's also exposing the London bombings." And they said that in itself is a problem for community cohesion. As people start to wake up, there will be massive widespread distrust in the government. And of course, I was a bit reluctant to go full frontal with this, but I did say, and by the way, I don't believe 9/11 anymore, and I don't believe the London bombings was as a government narrative anymore. And you're expecting me to say that the threat was from Islamic terrorism in a day's time. Would you please show me some proof? Now, just that alone alerted my Director of Intelligence to that fact. My Director of Intelligence then said, "Tony, you and I will never get them to tell the truth." So he didn't say I was wrong. And he says, "We're just the government foot soldiers." So basically, they were asking me to skirt around the notion of it being an inside job and carry on as normal and say that the threat was coming from Islamic terrorism. They also asked me at that point in time, just by giving them that alert, to go to occupational health and get yourself checked out. Admittedly, it was a bit. This was a courageous thing to do for me, to stick my head above the parapet, knowing that it could land me in big trouble. I wasn't naive, but I didn't expect them to sort of immediately push me towards occupational health. That in itself was menacing. And at this stage, on the 6th of July, they were still hoping to persuade me to go along with them with what I now consider to be a lie, and ignore and turn a blind eye to my own findings, albeit these findings were outside of work. And so that was the situation, and they wrapped me up in cotton socks on the 7th of July. Looked at my assignments to make sure I was in a position to deliver at the board meeting the next day. And I was, because I'd done all the scoring of these matrices. At the time, I'd scored it up in the belief that the threat was indeed coming from Islamic terrorism, because I believed the government rhetoric. So I'd accepted that initially as the truth, and nothing but the truth. And nothing that was coming to me by my special branch analysts that would give me sanitised reports ever differed from the government narrative. So I suddenly saw this as a challenge for me, that do I perpetuate the lie and just accept the government narrative and hand out a strategic threat assessment matrix, knowing what I know. And I come to the conclusion my conscience wouldn't allow me to do this. So although they thought I was going to do it, I was going to go along with it on the 7th, by the time I got home on the 7th of July 2010, exactly 5 years to the day of the London bombings, I resolved that my time had come to make a stance the next morning. So my tactic was to get in work extra early. So I got into work at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I looked at all my assignments that had all been prepared to delivery for the board meeting that afternoon, and in particular the front sheets of the strategic threat assessment matrix. And I'd scored it all up in accordance with what I considered to be the threat and harm and the risk. And I looked at it and says, this is all rubbish in the context of 9/11, 7/7 being inside jobs. So basically I bastardised the whole front sheet with the scoring system and put in some ludicrous looking scores that focused in on the counter-terrorism domain and focused in particular on 9/11 and 7/7. Now the strategic threat assessment matrix fed the control strategy, and I was also delivering the control strategy that day, or a proposal for the control strategy, which again had a front sheet, and that covered up to about 16 or so domains and themes that the force would focus on for the year. And behind these themes would be aims and objectives and rationale why it was a priority. And instead of actually showing them that front sheet that I'd prepared, again I bastardised that and crossed that out. And this would have things like how we'd tackle burglary dwelling, how we'd tackle public protection issues such as child abuse, how we'd tackle high volume crime as well as counter-terrorism. And I just completely crossed out everything as irrelevant other than the counter-terrorism domain, where I put in a little note in large font size, 9/11 truth, 7/7 truth. And when the boss comes in at 7 o'clock in the morning, I knocked on his door and said, do you want to have a quick look at the control strategy for the day and the strategic threat assessment matrix? Now the boss hadn't seen my preparation for this. It was another manager who'd checked me out the previous day. And I thrust it in front of his nose. And he got the shock of his life, basically, when he saw my ludicrous-looking scoring sheet, the threat assessment, and my proposal for the force control strategy that afternoon. And he immediately cottoned on that what I was doing was making a stance, and he wasn't going to change my mind. And although he said, look, again, he said, you and I will never get them to change, and we're just a government foot soldiers. But he realised that I was making a stance, and that this now was going to derail the board meeting that afternoon. And by this time, some of the fear had gone, and I decided, he decided to send me home and ask me to produce a report to explain the situation, in particular explain my stance. What he didn't want, and he made clear, was he didn't want my analysis as to why I thought 9/11 and 7/7 were an inside job. He just wanted me to explain why I felt compelled to do what I did and not deliver at the Intelligence Strategy Management Board, which was the board meeting. So off I went home and prepared a report over the weekend and took the report in. Now, I entitled the report A Rich Picture of an Ignoble Lie, and the rich picture referred to the government's counter-terrorism strategy. And rich picture involved collecting information intelligence, primarily targeting on the Muslim community as a result of the government's narrative on the terror threat, which was from Islamic extremism. And I saw that now as a putrid strategy already, because it was based on what? The falsehood behind the narrative of the London bombings and 9/11. And so I saw this now as demonising the Muslim communities. And South Yorkshire Police has a Muslim community, both in Rotherham and Sheffield. And therefore I felt it was my duty, and my conscience wouldn't allow me to do anything else other than to make that stance. And I didn't pull any punches in this report. I said, I'm a Principal Intelligence Analyst, not a spin doctor. I'm not your Alistair Campbell. A Principal Analyst is there to objectively analyse. You asked me to do analysis, and my analysis is that the threat seems to be coming more from internal tyranny in the counter-terrorism domain. And to this day, 18 months later, I've not come across anything that would lead to me to believe I was foolish to do that. So although I've lost my job through making that stance, I'm more convinced than ever that I was right. And I've done a lot more research behind it now. In a way, I was hoping I could be proved wrong, because the implications of what I'm saying here, 9/11, 7/7, inside job, well, people are working up in the country, but it's been a massive cover-up, and remains so both in America and in the United Kingdom, by our politicians, by our police service. The institutional denial that I've experienced, both within my own police force, South Yorkshire Police. Bear in mind, I'd worked for South Yorkshire Police with an exemplary record for 17 years. That institutional denial is a concern, and you see in more, standing back and taking a look at all this, you see numerous miscarriages of justice, the introduction of draconian terrorist laws, such as the Inquiries Act in 2005 and the Terrorism Act of 2006. You see in the erosion of civil liberties, and you see numerous miscarriages of justice, not just in the fact that within the London bombings they never had a proper inquiry, they never had post-mortems, but we had subsequent related issues. The Kingston trial were three collaborators, so-called collaborators of these so-called alleged bombers that I believe were actually set up as patsies. But these bombers that had never been proven guilty, these suicidal bombers that had never been proven guilty in a court of law, had three collaborators that were charged and tried, but on two separate occasions found not guilty. Now all of that meant, as far as I was concerned, that looking back, that the terror threat is perpetrated by our government to heighten the fear in the public, to allow the government to bring in these draconian measures, and to divide the country so that people are fearful of the Muslim communities, and it's the threat coming from young Islamic jihadists. And the case in point here, I think, the most telling programme since is the BBC programme Generation Jihad, that shows young jihadists and a number of case studies in a terrible light that is simply not balanced and is blatant propaganda. And when I see Sir Norman Bettison, the former Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, talking about this going on for the next generation without being satisfactorily resolved, without the merest mention of the possibility that the real underlying problem here is that the London bombings were not committed by four terrorists who were Muslim from Beeston and Aylesbury. In fact, they were committed by our intelligence services with full complicity by our Prime Minister then, and probably involvement with Mossad. That, when we look at what Tony Blair did straight away, this has all the hallmarks. This was done in the name of Islam, and Jack Straw saying this has all the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda. I'm sorry, when you can take a good look at this with your intelligence analysis hat on, this has all the hallmarks of an inside job. And you can do this reasonably scientifically, because you can list all the facts, not just at the time, but from the later hearing, the Lady Justice Hallett inquiry. And these are facts. And the way my approach would simply be, of all these 1,001 facts that are available, do these facts, when you look at them and stand back, point more towards a conceptual model that this is an inside job, or that the government are telling the truth? And on so many occasions, I'm afraid, it points towards the government narrative is untruthful. Now, if the government narrative is untruthful in so many areas, then the government have got something very serious to hide. And when the normal course of justice is not followed, so we've never had a hearing to establish guilt, we didn't have post-mortems. The Lady Justice Hallett inquiry revealed information and models about the carriages and the number 30 bus, which, when upon analysis, simply did nothing to confirm the government narrative. On the contrary, it contradicted it. But it wasn't evaluated properly within the Lady Justice Hallett inquiry. There was no scope within the terms of reference and within the hearing that unfolded for any critical evaluation of what was being presented. So everything was being presented as unvarnished truth, without a critical eye, but close examination of these exhibits that were shown, the models of these carriages and the witness statements, it simply didn't add up. So there are so many anomalies that, just like 9/11, it's blatantly obvious that they were inside jobs, and it's not rocket science. So in that wider context, 18 months down the line, I definitely see there's a new world order at work and a massive cover-up by our government. And the problem is there's only one politician, to the best of my knowledge, that's spoken out against either of these two attacks, and that was Michael Meacher. So Michael Meacher did at once upon a time stick his head above the parapet, but it wasn't long before he's been quietened and he won't speak out about 9/11 in spite of it being so obvious. And why is that? Well, these people running our country, running this global elite, are immensely powerful people, and I think there's fear. There's fear to speak out, there's corruption in high places, and there's cowardice. And I think in my situation, it's disappointing to be dismissed, but I'm going through an interesting employment appeal whereby the way it's turned might allow me to produce the analysis that so far has not actually appeared in the court itself, in the employment tribunal. So at the moment, my case is still alive, going through to the Employment Appeal Tribunal in London, where it's been fought on the Public Interest Disclosure Act. Now, that offers me a chance to reveal the analysis that I have, to reveal the deficiencies in the process that I was asked to do, which was a strategic threat assessment matrix. And on both counts there's a duty of care for me, because one, I was alleging criminality on the terror threat, and the fact that I was alleging state complicity with the London bombings. Now, under the Whistleblowing Act, or the Public Interest Disclosure Act, I should be entitled to do that without fear of being dismissed. And on the second area, I had been, as a Principal Intelligence Analyst for 2 years prior to 2010, I had been the biggest critic of the strategic threat assessment risk matrix models that were being asked to be introduced by the National Police Improvement Agency and been checked by Her Majesty's Inspectorate for Constabulary, the HMIC. But my first degree was applied statistics, and I saw these models that we were being asked to produce as a gimmick and totally unreliable and invalid from a statistical viewpoint. And then more to actually confirm a narrative rather than to analyse what the threat was. And these were very hideously crude models that didn't make sense, yet Principal Intelligence Analysts across the length and breadth of the country were producing these for senior management to confirm the decision making that was already being made. And inevitably, what the government were coming out with, and MI5 were coming out with, was a very dumbed down threat level assessment, which had 5 categories. Critical, substantial and severe were generally, it would hover between those 3 over time. But you were never told when it varied and when it lowered or hired what was the basis of it. But it was there to lead the people to believe that there was a threat. Invariably, there was a threat likely. But as I say, with 9/11 and 7/7 not being committed by Islamic extremists, but more perpetrated by our internal intelligence services and government, who could you trust here? I felt that these threat levels were deliberately there to exaggerate a fear. So it was a bogus threat that was being created in the minds of the public. The public were accepting this, and as a result of them accepting it, were clamouring for work. And this was justifying the aggressive foreign policy and justifying the implementation of draconian legislation that was coming in, and the erosion of our civil liberties at a time when we're going through a time of austerity and cutbacks. And this was now becoming so serious, I believe, that it was tantamount to becoming a police state. a fascist police state. And I think the way that I've been treated is a case of institutional denial. From the time I got dismissed in September 2010, going through the appeal process at the South Yorkshire Police Authority, which was in November 2010, going through the Employment Appeal Tribunal, which happened on a number of occasions in May 2011 and in September, where there was a 3-day substantive hearing for unfair dismissal. All that I experienced, and I encountered institutional denial within both the police service and the judicial system, and a propensity to tell untruths in order to protect reputations. And I think that's sad for me to have to relate back to any audience that, having worked with the police for so many years, that and work colleagues, that they're not brave enough to face up to the truth. And I know really that when a director of intelligence says, you and I will never get them to tell the truth, and when the director of finance in dismissing me says your views may well be correct, but it's incompatible with where we are today, they're saying to me in the code, we know you're probably right, but we're not prepared to do anything about it, so we've got to get rid of you. Or, they may well not have wanted to get rid of me, but there is an issue there as to, if I was making a protected disclosure, they had a duty to investigate. And they're on record in this employment tribunal of holding their hands up and saying, no, we didn't investigate Mr. Farrell's analysis. So I think there's a potential that the case could be won. And if it is won, then it could be highly embarrassing. Because questions will be asked and analysis will be allowed. And although this won't be a criminal court, it will be an employment appeal hearing tribunal, it could still be exceptionally embarrassing for senior statesmen in the United Kingdom and senior police officers.
Do you think that case will encourage other officers to come forward like you have? Or?
Well, I would hope so, but there's two ways of looking at it, because I think use me as an example to say, look, if you step out of line, this is what happens. We just get rid. We have him out of the way, and they dismissed me very quickly. And this was after an exemplary record with no allegation of any misconduct. They just got rid. Now, does that scare other people off from doing this? Well, I've become quite vocal in the truth movement. I've lost all fear, so I speak out against this. And what I have noticed is that police officers are increasingly coming up to me, shaking my hands and saying, Tony, we know you're right. You're doing a grand job. What do we do about this? And they tell me tales about some of the things where they know they should be doing something about it, but it's not been addressed properly within senior places in the police. So they're concerned. So there is an increasing body of police officers who are concerned with what's going on across the board within the police service. And so I think that by the same token, so me making this stance and actually falling and getting the sack, but taking it through what is a reasonably high profile appeal employment tribunal that is still alive and kicking, I hope that will encourage other people within the police service. I hope it will encourage other principal intelligence analysts and other intelligence analysts to challenge. And in my own function, and it is an important function that should be objective. They're not there as spin doctors, I've already said. They're there to provide analysis that gets us primarily to the truth. That should be the purpose of analysis. Not to court favour, not to side with one thing as opposed to another. Simply to provide analysis on the facts. And when it ceases to become that, as it did in my particular case, then we haven't got intelligence analysts, we've got spin doctors, and we've got the beginnings of a police state. So these are non-trivial issues. this couldn't get much bigger than what we're talking about. 9/11, the terror threat, the London bombings that led to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now you look at what's happening with imperialistic designs with America, backed by our own government, within Libya, within Syria, and I dare say it's frightening what's going on with Iran. And all this was foretold before 9/11 by the neocons in America. We look to Zbigniew Brzezinski and his grand chessboard. We look to the Project for the New American Century, where they were planning a catastrophic event that would engage the American people in such a way that they would agree to and support an aggressive foreign policy agenda in the Middle East. And 9/11 was your new Pearl Harbor, where the people supported the war on terror at first and were blind to the obvious. And it's worked a treat. So even 11 years on, the American people, even if they are alert to the possibility, are not challenging their government in sufficiently stern terms to get to the bottom of the issue. And just like they still haven't done that nearly 50 years on from the JFK assassination. And there is a movement within the United Kingdom that calls for an independent inquiry for the London bombings. But it falls on deaf ears, and it doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. And you haven't got a single politician speaking out against the London bombings. And yet, when you stand back and look at the evidence and analyse it properly, it all points to an inside job. And it's inconceivable that politicians aren't aware of that possibility, but they're not prepared to look into it. They're completely turning a blind eye, and that's serious. And how we break through that, so that the pressure turns on politicians to do something about this, when the public remain blind by and large, is quite a challenge. But it's an incredibly important challenge, because we can't allow the government to perpetuate this divisive policy which is leading to alienation, it's leading to hatred, and it's done in such a way that people from one faith are fearful of another, and it's all exaggerated. And we have got in England, in the United Kingdom, we've got right-wing groups such as the British National Party, we've got the English Defence League, pitted against the United Against Fascism, and we are at the other end of the extreme. We do see on the streets extreme jihadists, but often when they're shouting, we see an impotent police service, unwilling to arrest, almost allowing it to happen. And yet, anybody dares so much speak out, a Muslim dares so much speak out about, and the mere suggestion of 9/11, 7/7 being inside jobs, they may well treat differently. And I think in the United Kingdom now there's a great fear of what's happening, and that I think there's probably three categories of people. Those that are actually evil themselves, those that are alert to the possibility but are cowardly and don't say anything, those that simply are too plugged in to the drug, the television, and simply haven't got a clue, because they're blissfully unaware of anything other than what the mainstream media tell them. And those that really do know the truth and are willing to put their head above the parapet and fight for it. But those at the moment in our country are in the tiny minority, where we've got state persons that really matter. We've got a precious few that have the courage to speak out about the corruption in high places and speak out against the obvious lies that have occurred with the London bombings.
What's your message for those people with the courage to speak up?
I think let's start with the police service, because I'm most familiar with that. I think that my own profession, analysts, should certainly start to create waves and under no circumstance compromise their value system. So if they're placed in a position where they're forced to or expected to say the threat comes based on government rhetoric when they know that it should be otherwise, that they have the courage to make a stance in a similar way. They can't keep sacking analysts if they do that. They've got to take no. At the same token, we've got senior, very well paid ACPO, Association of Chief Police Officers, who will be alert to 9/11 and 7/7. And they have a voice and they have an obligation and a duty of care to speak up when they see evil. And I think the police service should follow the mantra, their own mantra. I mean, for instance, in my force, when I joined the service, I was quite encouraged because the mantra that I was familiar with at the time was justice with courage. And I like that mantra. But they sacked me for showing courage when I saw injustice. So they weren't walking the talk. And I think that's what's necessary. In fact, I'm reminded from Edmund Burke in 1774, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. So the message, succinctly put, is to do something and speak out. And for those in senior positions to start shouting for the rooftops. And I think there is a chance that the police will become divided over this. But if the police remain silent and complicit, then we are spiralling towards a police state. And I think there are too many good people in the police service to allow that to happen. So I'm optimistic if the message can be put out forcefully, then I've got hope that the police will start to heal itself. But I think it's rather likely to come from a bottom-up approach, because I'm beginning to lose a little bit of faith in the leadership across the police service at the moment. I think we have problems with Freemasonry, and we have problems with corruption. We have problems with the New World Order and the agenda, the common purpose agenda. So they are, as my Director of Intelligence eloquently put, merely the government foot soldiers. Well, they're not, they're public servants, and they have a duty to the public, and a duty to honour their oath as they signed up as police officers. And that oath means putting into practice, and it is a question of justice with courage, and standing for the truth, and for justice. And there can be no sacred cows. So, the government, the intelligence services are not exempt. So when they have committed murderous criminal acts, somebody somewhere in the police service at high rank needs to stick their head above the parapet and take action. And that's my hope and that's my plea. And I hope that enough good people in the police service start to wake up and galvanise into some effective action.